Our next talk, Finding Your Genius, is Dr. Phil Price, who's Programme Director for our Strength and Conditioning degree. Phil is somebody who I know and has told me that he always likes to challenge himself. And the summer before last reached the summit of Mount Elbrus in Russia. I'm not quite sure what the height of that was, Phil. 5,600 meters, so we're looking at probably close to 20,000 feet. And reached Everest Base Camp this summer. So he certainly has found his own genius and certainly, I'm sure, dug deep into inner reserves in order to achieve those two accomplishments. Phil, I'll hand over to you.
Right, thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you everyone here for coming to hear me speak. When I was asked to actually present here today, I thought, oh, this is a really good opportunity. It's an opportunity to speak to the students, essentially. Because what I found is when students come to higher education, it's such a huge step up from further education, and they're getting bombarded with information, and they've got to memorize this information in such a short space of time. And it can get very overwhelming, and it can lead to students start thinking, oh, I'm not clever enough for this, I'm not good enough. And then that leads to students getting grades which they feel that they don't deserve or could have got better, or even worse, leads to students leaving the course. And what I want essentially to get to students is, don't worry, be patient, find your way of learning, and essentially you'll be able to learn anything. Because I tend to reflect back, and I realised I was very much a B student throughout school, sixth form, a lot. And every time I'd work really hard for exams or assignments, and I'd get this feedback saying, oh, you need to elaborate more on your discussion points, for example. I'm thinking, well, how can I get with that? Like, I've essentially gone through the textbook, I've made notes on the textbook, I've then revised the notes from the textbook, so how am I constantly coming away with a B? And then there was an assessment at my third year of uni. I studied here at St Mary's, and it suddenly clicked. I was memorizing the content. I wasn't actually learning it. So for the last few years, I've really focused on, how can I essentially be a good learner? And I think it's worked out quite well. And essentially this has led me to believe that I really think there's a genius within all of us. And I'm not saying there's an Albert Einstein within me or anything like that, mostly because I think, there's more to learn than just intelligence. But there is an ability to maximize your potential for learning any content that you may be passionate about. So essentially what I wanted to do for this presentation was provide my philosophical approach to life and what I've done essentially to find my way of learning. So in its purest form, I believe that life is just an endless list of questions. We're bombarded with information left, right and centre from our senses, stored in our long-term and our short-term memory, and we utilise this information to formulate questions. And that's how essentially we go through life. And then we come to a question, we get an answer, we think, great, we've got a new answer, we put that in the information bank, and then we utilise it to form our next question. But if we really want to enhance our learning, we've got to affect our line of questioning. So I try and encourage all of our students to be the 3 C's. 1, I want you to be curious, so really yearn to want to learn more in areas that have been yet unexplored. I want you to be critical, don't take everything at face value, want to know why. And also be very creative. How can you be creative with your questionings to lead you down a path of questions that no one's ever done before? So, to enhance these 3 C's, I've developed 5 principles which I try and follow. Okay, number 1, never stop becoming self-aware. So, what I've noticed is that self-development is really quite popular at the moment. And you hear these phrases like, work on your weaknesses, or stick to your strengths, and then you can buy loads of books on how to become a great leader, or how to follow the habits of billionaires, all that sort of thing. And I think this is great. People are actively trying to find new ways to really better themselves. But people need to understand that this is very much an ongoing process. If you work on your weaknesses, you start to neglect your strengths. If you focus only on your strengths, your weaknesses become weaker. So it's a constant balance of trying to understand yourself as a person and how you work with your strengths and weaknesses and how these change over time. celebrate your weirdness, your idols were probably weird too. Now, be honest, we're all a little bit weird, aren't we? Yeah? I thought so. And I think that's great. But what I think when people formulate their line of questions, they try and narrow it down and constrain themselves to social norms. So how does that really help your line of questioning if you're essentially following the crowd and your line of questioning becomes similar to everyone else? And I started to think, if that happens, then think about all of those great ideas that have gone to waste because people were probably a little bit scared of what other people thought they may get laughed at. So really embrace your weirdness and follow your own path and line of questioning. And I always like to utilise Pablo Picasso or David Bowie because they followed their own line of questioning and it kind of worked out well for them. They created brand new stuff which challenged social norms and actually changed them so they actually change and become the new normal. So, and that's why we idolise them. That's why they're our idols, because they were innovators and they changed the way we think. So really embrace your weirdness and follow your own path. Number 3, learn broad. Okay, so there always seems to be this weird battle between the arts and the sciences, you know, which one is better. And I just thought, well, actually, I think they're as good as each other, and we actually need both of them. And that comes from reflecting on, focus on areas that are outside my remit. So obviously I work in strength and conditioning, but learning other topics, such as, in my case, classic literature and Buddhism, just areas I have of interest in, I find that when I come back to strength and conditioning, I look at it in a completely different viewpoint with brand new creativity, and it makes me challenge my viewpoint on it. So all of a sudden, just by learning something completely outside of my area, I have really found transferable skills when it comes to bringing it back to strength and conditioning. I just want to allude back to that little story I said at the beginning of my 3rd year where I had a bit of a light bulb moment and I thought, oh, I'm actually memorising content, I'm not actually learning it. But for some reason at the time, I really associated it with reading. So I started reading more, but I started to branch out a little bit. So on top of reading academic papers, I started reading blog posts, I started reading classic literature, I started reading non-fiction, science fiction. And all of a sudden, I realised I was exposing myself to different forms of the written word and different forms of communication. So that was allowing me to try and interpret the information or interpret a message hidden within a story. And I found that incredibly beneficial because if I hadn't done that, I hadn't learned the tools to then all of a sudden express all this knowledge I was acquiring. So all of a sudden, that feedback of you're not giving enough in your discussion points, I now had the tools to do it. And then in recent years, I realised, oh, loads of people are reading. It's really quite popular, isn't it? And then I look a little bit deeper, and everyone's starting to read in their narrow forms. For example, self-help books seem to be incredibly popular at the moment, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I certainly read a few self-help books. But if you just narrow yourself to one sort of genre, all of a sudden you're not exposing yourself to different forms of communication. You're limiting your ability to extract information and then express it. So, in other words, read to learn, not to be told what to do, and don't stop reading. And then finally, I find the best memories always occur from events where you had to make a selection of choices. So good choices could be from going outside your comfort zone and presenting at a conference, and then bad choices could be not actually preparing for that conference and making a complete mess of your presentation. However, I find either way, these are memorable stories because you learn from them. And when we start developing our line of questioning, the ones we learn end up being the ones that we memorize the most. And that's because they make a story. So next time that you're faced with a particular question, ask yourself, will it make a good story? So that essentially is an overview of the journey I took to try and find ways of learning and continue to improve myself. So I just want to say to all students, be patient, don't worry, be critical, be curious, and be creative, and you'll find your way of learning and you'll unlock that genius within. Thank you very much.